He walked onto the plane with a calm smile, holding a first-class ticket in one hand and a cane in the other. He greeted the crew, took his seat, and quietly opened his newspaper. But minutes later, the flight attendant stood over him, questioning everything. His seat, his booking, and even his presence. She didn't ask twice. She forced him out in front of the entire cabin. What she didn't know was that the quiet man she had just embarrassed wasn't just another passenger. He was one of the airline's original founders. And before that flight touched the ground, her world would begin to fall apart. Before we start the story, comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. They said it was just a routine check, a small error, nothing personal. But when Harold stepped onto that plane, holding his ticket in one hand and his cane in the other, he didn't expect to become the center of a storm. He was 74, sharp-eyed despite his age, and carried himself with quiet pride. Dressed in a neat gray suit and polished black shoes, he walked slowly but confidently toward seat 1A in first class. A few passengers glanced his way, some offering polite nods, others simply watching. He gave a small nod in return, placed his leather briefcase beneath the seat, and carefully lowered himself into the wide cushion. The cabin was calm, filled with low conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Harold unfolded his newspaper, adjusted his glasses, and settled in like a man who had done this many times before. He didn't look around much. He wasn't trying to stand out. He just wanted a peaceful flight. The seat next to him was empty, and he seemed to enjoy the quiet moment. A few rows back, a couple whispered to each other, laughing softly. On the opposite aisle, a young man scrolled through his phone. It was an ordinary scene, until Paige, one of the flight attendants, walked past Harold and paused. She stood for a moment, looking at him with narrowed eyes, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her smile nowhere to be found. "Excuse me, sir," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Harold looked up, his brow slightly raised. "Yes," he said calmly. 1A. Paige tilted her head, unconvinced. "Can I see your ticket, please?" Harold reached into his inside pocket, pulled out the boarding pass, and handed it to her without hesitation. She stared at it for longer than needed, flipping it once, then again, her expression unchanged. "This is for first class," she said flatly. Harold nodded once. "Correct." But she didn't hand the ticket back. She didn't move on. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, searching for someone, as if needing backup. Several passengers were now quietly watching. One woman leaned to her husband and whispered something. Paige seemed to grow more tense by the second. "I'll need to confirm something with the gate," she said, not looking him in the eye. "Please remain here." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked briskly toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking against the cabin floor. Harold stayed still. He slowly folded his hands over his cane and stared forward. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A quiet shift. The kind that comes when a man has seen this happen before and knows exactly what it means. In the galley, Paige stood near the service phone, her arms stiff at her sides. She tapped her fingers on the counter, her jaw tight. A younger flight attendant, Rachel, noticed the tension and walked over with 2 bottles of water in her hands. "Everything okay?" Rachel asked, her tone low. Paige hesitated. "There's a man in 1A. Something's off." Rachel blinked. "Off? What do you mean?" "He handed me a first-class ticket, but—" Paige trailed off, then leaned in slightly. "Does he look like the kind of person who flies in 1A?" Rachel's eyebrows lifted. "What's that supposed to mean?" Paige glanced away, shrugging. "I don't know. Something just doesn't add up." Rachel's expression shifted from casual to cautious. "Well, if his ticket says 1A, then he's in the right place." "I'm checking with the gate," Paige said quickly, picking up the phone. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Can you confirm a first-class booking for Harold Green?" "Yes, seat 1A." There was a pause. Paige tapped her fingers again. The voice on the other end responded, muffled. Page's eyes narrowed. Yes, confirmed? Fully paid? Another pause. All right. She hung up, her face unreadable. Rachel raised a brow. So? It's confirmed, Page muttered. But instead of walking back with an apology, she stood still, her thoughts clearly tangled. After a moment, she squared her shoulders and walked back toward the first-class cabin, her face tense. As she returned to Harold's row, her expression had hardened. Sir, she said in a tone colder than before, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. There seems to be a problem with your booking after all. I'll need you to come with me to the galley. Harold looked up slowly, folding his newspaper. His eyes locked on hers, calm but piercing. What kind of problem? He asked. His voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made Page blink. I can't discuss it here, she said, motioning him to follow. The cabin had grown quieter. A man in 2B lowered his phone, listening. A woman across the aisle frowned at the exchange. Harold stood slowly, steadying himself with his cane. He glanced back toward the seat he was being forced to leave, then toward the watching eyes around him. With no resistance, he gave a polite nod to the nearby passengers and followed Page down the aisle. His pace was slow, but deliberate, and though he said nothing more, something in his silence made it clear. He wasn't confused and he wasn't powerless. Not at all. Back in the first-class cabin, the air shifted. The atmosphere that had been calm just moments ago now felt heavy, uncertain. Several passengers exchanged glances. The man in 2B leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered, That man didn't do anything. Why'd they move him? She shook her head, frowning. His ticket said first class, I saw it. Meanwhile, Rachel watched from the galley entrance, her expression growing tense. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face said enough. Something wasn't right. In the galley, Page stood stiffly beside Harold as he rested one hand on the wall and the other on his cane. The confined space made the moment feel even more uncomfortable. We're still trying to verify your seat, she said, not meeting his eyes. Until then, we'll need you to wait here or move to the back of the plane. Harold took a slow breath. I already showed you my ticket. It's confirmed. Paid in full. Page hesitated. Sometimes mistakes happen. Computer errors, last-minute changes. We just need to be sure. Harold looked at her, not angry, not loud, just steady. And while you're being sure, you decided to remove me from my seat. There was a pause. Her eyes flicked away again. I follow protocol, she said, her voice tighter now. It's not personal. Harold smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. That's what they always say. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim black phone. Page's eyes flicked to it as he pressed a number and lifted it to his ear. His voice, calm and smooth, filled the small space. Yes. It's happening again. Yes. Same situation. Seat 1A. First class. Go ahead. He ended the call just as quietly and returned the phone to his pocket. Page stared at him, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The unease on her face was clear now, a flicker of something between doubt and discomfort. But Harold said nothing more. He simply leaned back slightly, steady on his cane, his expression as calm as ever, like he already knew what was coming next. Back in first class, the murmurs had grown louder. A man in a navy blazer turned in his seat and looked toward the galley. That guy was nothing but polite, he said quietly to a flight attendant passing by. Why was he moved? The attendant hesitated but didn't answer. She simply kept walking, her face tense. Rachel stood near the curtain watching the passengers with growing concern. Her jaw tightened. She knew Page had crossed a line, but saying anything now would only make things worse, at least for the moment. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding. In the cockpit, the captain's phone buzzed. He picked it up, expecting a routine update, but his expression shifted within seconds. Yes, sir. He's on board. Seat 1A. Yes, I understand. He paused, then added, No, I wasn't informed. I'll handle it. He hung up and turned toward the co-pilot, his voice firm. "We've got a situation." "What kind?" the co-pilot asked, surprised. "An executive-level passenger was just moved from first class without cause," the captain said. "Apparently he's not just a regular customer." Back in the galley, Paige's phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket and glanced at the screen. Her face paled. She stared for a few seconds before locking it quickly and slipping it away. Harold remained standing, quiet and still. His eyes didn't leave her. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. Paige's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She forced a breath and tried to speak again, this time more carefully. "I've just received some information," she said, her voice shaky now. "Would you mind returning to your seat? It seems it's all been cleared." Harold didn't respond right away. He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single nod and turned toward the aisle. Each step he took was measured and slow. The sound of his cane tapping gently on the floor, the only sound in the suddenly silent cabin. Paige followed a few steps behind, her shoulders tense. When Harold stepped back into first class, passengers turned to look. Some leaned forward, others whispered. Rachel moved aside quickly, her face unreadable. Harold reached seat 1A and paused. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he turned, looked at the cabin around him, and then back at Paige. She stopped mid-step. "I'll sit," Harold said quietly, "but I don't forget." Then he sat down without another word. Paige stood frozen, unsure if she should walk away or explain herself. But Harold had already opened his newspaper again. He wasn't reading it. He was just waiting. Paige returned to the galley with hurried steps, her chest rising and falling as if the air had grown too heavy. She pulled out her phone again, rereading the message she had received only minutes earlier. Her fingers trembled slightly. The name had been there in bold letters. Harold Green, Executive Advisory Board, Priority Shareholder. Her throat tightened. She hadn't just embarrassed a passenger, she had embarrassed the wrong one. Rachel was already waiting, arms folded across her chest. "You found out who he is, didn't you?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Paige didn't answer right away. She leaned against the counter and stared at the wall. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" Rachel shook her head. "You didn't need to know who he was. You just needed to treat him with respect. His name shouldn't have mattered." Paige looked away. In the first-class cabin, Harold sat silently. His expression was calm but not relaxed. He hadn't touched his drink. He hadn't unfolded the newspaper again. Instead, he glanced around the cabin, watching the people who had watched him, passengers pretending to be absorbed in books or screens, their eyes occasionally flicking his way. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer leaned forward again. "Sir," he said softly, "what just happened? It didn't feel right." Harold turned his head slowly. "No," he replied. "It wasn't." The man nodded, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry." Harold gave him a small nod. "Thank you." Just then, a soft chime sounded through the speakers, followed by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be departing shortly. Please remain seated while our crew finalizes preparations." The usual words, but they sounded heavier now. The cabin fell into a stiff quiet. At the same moment, Paige was still in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. Her hands were clammy. Rachel stepped closer, her voice low. "You need to apologize. Properly." Paige stared at her. He already went back to his seat. "That's not enough," Rachel said. "You treated him like a problem, in front of everyone." Paige opened her mouth to respond, but her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the captain. "You'll need to speak with him before landing. Executive team has been notified. Prepare to explain your actions." The color drained from her face. Meanwhile, Harold sat back, placed a hand on his cane, and looked out the window. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and the storm had already started. But he didn't look afraid. He looked ready. The plane began to taxi, but the tension inside the cabin didn't move. It sat in the air, thick and quiet. Paige stayed in the galley, barely able to focus on the tasks in front of her. She poured water into glasses, but her hands weren't steady. Her mind was stuck on the message from the captain. Prepare to explain your actions. That line kept echoing in her head like a warning bell. Rachel watched her carefully, then finally stepped closer. You can't pretend this didn't happen, Paige, she said, her voice still low but more pointed now. You questioned him without cause, you moved him without confirming the booking, and you did it in front of everyone. I didn't mean to insult him, Paige replied quickly, defensive. You thought he didn't look like he belonged there, Rachel interrupted. You didn't say it out loud, but everyone felt it. He felt it. Paige turned away, her jaw tightening. She hated being called out. But deep down, she knew Rachel was right. She'd seen Harold, judged him by his appearance, and acted before checking the facts. And now that mistake wasn't just hers to carry. It had reached the captain, the executive office, and possibly higher. Meanwhile, Harold sat in his seat, his face calm but unreadable. He hadn't spoken a word since returning to 1A. But his silence said enough. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a storm brewing quietly in the corner. The man across the aisle, still watching him, finally spoke again. If you don't mind me asking, sir, are you someone important in the company? Harold turned his head slowly. I was one of the original advisors when the airline was founded, he replied. Now I sit on the board. I still own part of it. The man blinked, surprised. You helped start it? Harold gave a single nod. 50 years ago. A soft murmur spread among nearby passengers. Those who overheard sat up straighter. The older woman in 1C leaned toward her husband, whispering something. The man who had recorded earlier pulled out his phone again, glancing between the screen and Harold. Rachel returned to the cabin a few minutes later, slowly moving through the aisle to check on passengers. When she reached Harold, she paused. Sir, she said quietly, bending slightly so others couldn't hear. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened earlier. I didn't agree with it. Harold looked at her for a second, then gave a small nod. I noticed. She straightened up, gave him a respectful smile, and moved on. From the front of the cabin, Paige stood watching. Her face was tense. She'd seen the nod, the brief exchange, and somehow it made her feel smaller. Rachel had done what she should have done an hour ago, but now it felt too late for a quick apology. As the plane lifted into the sky, Paige finally walked back to the galley. She didn't touch her phone. She didn't speak to anyone. She just stood quietly, staring at nothing, trying to figure out what she could say that would even matter now. In 1A, Harold stared out the window as the clouds drifted by. His hands rested on the head of his cane, still and firm. He had made one call. Now everything else was simply catching up to that moment. At 30,000 feet, the plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, but the calm inside the aircraft was nothing more than a surface illusion. Paige moved mechanically through her duties, her smile tight, her eyes avoiding the first-class cabin. Every time she passed by Harold's row, her chest tightened. She could feel the stares from passengers, some judging, some simply curious, but all aware of what had happened. In the galley, she tried to collect herself. She opened a drawer to restock snacks, but her hands moved slower than usual. Her thoughts kept circling back to the beginning of the flight. Why had she assumed he didn't belong in first class? Why had she acted so quickly without checking twice? Deep down she knew the answer, but it was easier not to name it. Easier to say it was protocol, even if it wasn't. Rachel entered the galley again with an empty tray in hand. She placed it down and looked at Paige. Are you going to talk to him or just wait until we land and hope this disappears? I already let him return to his seat, Paige said quietly, her voice thin. Rachel crossed her arms. You didn't let him do anything. He never should have been moved in the first place. Paige turned away, but Rachel didn't stop. You made it personal when it never should have been. He wasn't loud, he wasn't rude. He didn't even argue with you. And that should have told you something. I didn't know who he was, Paige whispered almost to herself. Rachel's voice dropped lower, firmer. You shouldn't have needed to. Silence hung between them for a few long seconds. Then Rachel picked up the tray and left without another word. Back in first class, Harold sat motionless, his eyes scanning a page in a hardcover book, though it was clear his mind was elsewhere. Occasionally he looked around, not nervously, not impatiently, but thoughtfully, like a man keeping notes on the world around him. His presence had a quiet weight. It didn't demand attention, but it was impossible to ignore. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer, now known to be a lawyer, opened his laptop. He typed something briefly, then looked up at Harold. "Sir, I just want to say again, I'm sorry you were treated that way," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Harold gave a small nod, offering a reply without emotion. "Thank you, but this wasn't the first time." That answer made the man pause. Rachel returned to the cabin a few minutes later and refilled a few water glasses. As she walked by Harold, she gave a polite smile. He responded with a nod, but his eyes were distant now, fixed on something beyond the window. In the galley, Paige's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the captain. "Update, Executive Office has confirmed his identity. They're preparing a response. Expect contact upon landing. Be ready to provide a statement." Paige's stomach dropped. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray in front of her. This wasn't going to quietly fade into the background. She had tried to make it about rules, but now the rules were coming back, with her name written on them. The plane continued across the sky, smooth and steady, but every mile brought the moment closer, when Harold's silence would end, and someone much higher than her would start asking the real questions. The flight continued, but Paige felt every minute stretching longer than it should. Even the soft hum of the engines, once a background comfort, now rang in her ears like a ticking clock. She walked through the aisle slower than usual, her eyes down, her smile forced. When passengers asked for drinks, she nodded silently and poured with careful hands. She no longer tried to make conversation. The lightness in her movements was gone. Everything about her now was tight, rehearsed, cautious. In contrast, Harold remained the picture of calm. He hadn't spoken more than a few words since his return to first class, but that silence had power. It unsettled those who had witnessed what happened, especially Paige. It was the kind of silence that held meaning, not bitter, not loud, just steady, controlled, and deliberate. That kind of silence didn't belong to someone defeated. It belonged to someone who had already taken steps far beyond the reach of a small apology. Meanwhile, the other passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. The woman in 1C, who had said nothing earlier, now glanced at Harold with something close to admiration. The man in 3A, who had watched everything from the start, opened a new note in his phone and began typing. A story, perhaps. A tweet. A complaint. Whatever it was, it would not be kept quiet. Rachel came through with the dessert tray and stopped beside Harold's seat. "Would you like anything, sir?" she asked kindly. Harold looked at her and gave a small nod. "Coffee, black." She poured it and handed it to him with both hands. "If you need anything else, anything at all, just press the call button." He looked at her again, this time more directly. "You've been respectful from the beginning." "Thank you." Rachel gave a soft smile. "That's how we're supposed to treat people, sir." He nodded, took the coffee and turned back to his book. From the front of the cabin, Paige saw the exchange. Her grip tightened around the service tablet in her hands. Her fingers were cold. She felt out of place now in the very section she thought she had control over. She wasn't being asked for help anymore. She was being avoided. She turned back toward the galley, but just as she did, a message pinged on the crew device. "Urgent, confirmed report submitted by passenger Harold Green. Executive team has flagged incident for board review. Prepare formal statement. Captain will be informed to ground follow-up team upon landing." Paige felt the breath catch in her throat. A review. A board-level review. That wasn't just a warning. That meant her name, her words, her actions, all of it, were already part of a file being read by people far above her. Rachel stepped into the galley behind her, saw the look on her face, and didn't even have to ask. She knew. Paige's voice cracked. "He reported it." Rachel nodded slowly. "You didn't leave him much of a choice." I never meant to. It doesn't matter what you meant, Rachel said sharply, her tone no longer gentle. It matters what you did. You didn't just humiliate a passenger. You humiliated one of the people who helped build this airline. Paige didn't respond. She stood there, eyes locked on the tablet screen, unable to look away from the words that had just marked the start of her reckoning. At the same time, Harold sat sipping his coffee, unmoved by the soft turbulence that rippled beneath the plane. To him, it felt like a familiar pattern. Dignity stripped quietly, apologies whispered too late, respect offered only when power was revealed. But this time something was different. This time he wasn't walking away quietly. He had made one phone call. The rest of the story was already writing itself. As the plane flew through the high skies, the energy inside the cabin shifted from awkward to tense. First class, usually full of casual chatter and light drinks, had turned into a place of quiet stares and silent thoughts. People were no longer simply passengers. They were now quiet witnesses to something they couldn't unsee. Some had been whispering since takeoff. Others had gone completely still, their eyes occasionally darting to the front where Harold sat, calm and collected in seat 1A. Meanwhile, Paige remained in the galley, staring blankly at the metal drawer she had opened for the third time, forgetting what she needed. Her thoughts were spinning. Every small noise in the cabin made her flinch. Every passing second brought her closer to the landing, and closer to the moment when she'd have to answer for what she had done. And not just to her supervisor, not just to the captain. This time, it would be to the people whose names were printed at the top of the company's letterhead. She kept replaying the first interaction in her head, the tone she had used, the way she stood over him, how she took the ticket and barely looked at it before deciding to act. At the time, it had felt like she was just doing her job, but now, stripped of excuses, it looked very different. She hadn't followed protocol. She hadn't asked for a second opinion. She'd simply looked at Harold and assumed he didn't belong. Rachel returned to the galley, holding an empty tray. "They're asking for more coffee in row 2, she said, placing it down. Her tone was tight. Paige looked at her, desperate for something. Maybe help, maybe forgiveness. But she found nothing in Rachel's face except quiet disappointment. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Paige said. Rachel glanced at her. But it did. "I didn't know who he was," Paige repeated, the words starting to sound like an excuse even to herself. Rachel raised her eyebrows. "Would it have mattered if he was just another passenger?" Paige opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Rachel stepped closer. "You know what this is really about. It's not just what you did to him, it's what you showed everyone else on that plane. You showed them exactly how easy it is for someone to be stripped of respect just because of how they look." The words hit Paige harder than any warning she'd received from the captain. She looked down at her hands, realizing they were shaking slightly. Her pride, her confidence, her authority. It had all vanished the moment Harold's name appeared in that message from the executive office. And now, the crew knew. The captain knew. And soon, the board would know every detail. Back in first class, Harold hadn't moved much. He sat with his legs crossed, one hand resting on the head of his cane, the other holding a book that he hadn't turned the page on in 20 minutes. But he wasn't waiting. He was observing. He had been in rooms like this before, except they weren't planes, and the stakes weren't this public. He knew what came next. It was always the same. Panic behind closed doors, rushed explanations, and someone being sent to offer a polite smile and a shallow apology. But Harold had no interest in shallow this time. He had lived long enough to know that apologies don't fix systems. They only work when they're followed by change. A few rows back, the man in the navy blazer leaned toward the woman next to him. "He hasn't said much since it happened, has he?" "No," the woman replied softly. "But I don't think he needs to." They both turned forward again. Quiet. In the cockpit, the captain was preparing for descent, but his focus kept shifting. The report he'd received earlier from the executive office was clear. Harold Green's presence must be handled with care. A full review was in progress. No excuses, no delays. It was the kind of message that didn't just come from public relations. It came from the board. And the board didn't send warnings unless something had gone very, very wrong. He picked up the intercom handset and pressed the crew button. "Miss Carter," he said using Paige's last name, "please be advised. Upon landing, a ground team will board. They'll be speaking to you directly." There was a long pause before Paige answered quietly. "Understood, Captain." Rachel looked over at her. "That's it then." Paige nodded slowly, her face pale. "Yeah, that's it." And as the plane began to lower through the clouds, the weight of what waited on the ground grew heavier by the second. Paige wasn't just about to face an angry passenger. She was about to face the people who signed her paycheck. And Harold. He wasn't just an old man who wanted justice. He was the reminder that power doesn't always need to raise its voice to change the course of everything around it. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft began its smooth descent toward the city lights below. Flight attendants walked briskly through the aisles, securing trays and reminding passengers to fasten seatbelts. But there was no usual cheer in their voices, no jokes, no smiles. Everyone was going through the motions, but the cabin's atmosphere was heavy. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. The kind that wrapped itself around people when they knew something important was about to happen. Harold hadn't moved from his seat. He leaned slightly against the window, the hum of the engines vibrating faintly beneath his feet. The book still sat open on his lap, untouched. The coffee beside him had gone cold, but his posture hadn't changed. His breathing was even, and yet his presence seemed louder now than it had ever been. He didn't need to speak. Everyone already knew his silence carried weight. Behind him, passengers were whispering in low tones. No one had forgotten what happened, and now they were all waiting for the outcome, like observers at the end of a courtroom trial. Many of them didn't know who Harold Green truly was. They had no idea he had once stood in front of the very board now reviewing Paige's actions. They didn't know he had spent a lifetime pushing for fairness in spaces that weren't built for people who looked like him. But they understood enough. They had seen something wrong happen, and they had seen how calm, steady silence could carry more power than yelling ever could. In the front galley, Paige stood frozen by the service counter. She had finished the final checks, closed every compartment, and straightened her uniform 5 times over. But nothing could make her hands stop trembling. She had just come from the restroom, where she had splashed cold water on her face. But it hadn't helped. Her reflection had stared back at her with the same pale skin and hollowed expression, reminding her that this wasn't a dream. She had messed up, and now the landing was minutes away. The crew would disembark, but she would stay behind. Rachel leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed. She hadn't spoken since the captain's announcement. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was low. "Have you figured out what you're going to say?" Paige didn't answer right away. She blinked a few times, her throat dry. I don't know what they want to hear." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be thinking about what they want to hear. You should be thinking about what's true." "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Paige repeated for the 4th time that hour. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Rachel shook her head, disappointed. "You saw an older black man sitting in first class and decided he didn't fit. That's not doing your job. That's making a judgment." Paige's lips parted, but no words came. "I've worked with you for over 2 years," Rachel continued, her voice still calm but unrelenting. "And I've never seen you act that fast with anyone else. He didn't speak out of turn. He didn't argue. You just looked at him and decided he didn't belong." Paige leaned against the wall, her eyes glassy. "I ruined everything in less than 5 minutes." "No," Rachel said quietly. "You showed who you really are in less than 5 minutes. What you do next is the only part that might fix it." The plane jolted softly as it touched the runway. The tires hissed beneath them, and the engines reversed with a heavy breath, slowing the plane down. The final announcement came over the speakers, but it felt almost unnecessary. No one was rushing to grab their bags. Everyone seemed to be waiting. Paige glanced toward the cabin door. Her stomach turned. Her palms were slick with sweat. She wiped them on her uniform. "Do you think I'll be fired?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Rachel paused. "I don't know." Paige nodded, pressing her lips together. She felt cold, the kind of cold that wasn't about temperature, but about regret. At the front of the plane, Harold adjusted his coat and reached for his briefcase. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. Celia, the elderly woman seated nearby, turned slightly toward him. "You stayed calm through all of it," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Harold smiled faintly. "Being calm is what people like me have had to learn. A long time ago." Her eyes softened. "I hope they do right by you." He gave a slow nod. "We'll see." As passengers began standing to collect their bags, the usual rustle and chatter was replaced by quiet movements and lingering stares toward Harold. No one said anything out loud, but it was clear they were curious how this would end. The door opened. 2 men in tailored suits stepped inside. Their ID badges were clipped neatly to their jackets, and behind them stood a uniformed security officer with a tablet in hand. They didn't need to say a word. Everyone knew who they had come for. They made their way past the passengers with quiet steps. The man in front stopped at Harold's row and nodded respectfully. "Mr. Green," he said, "thank you for your patience. We're here on behalf of the executive board. If you have a moment, we'd like to speak with you once everyone has disembarked." Harold stood slowly, steadying himself with his cane. "I've got time," he said. The man nodded. "Thank you." Then they moved forward, to the front galley, where Paige stood waiting. One of the suits stopped in front of her, pulled out a small device, and tapped the screen. "Miss Carter will need to speak with you. Please remain on board. Security will assist." Paige nodded stiffly, her mouth dry, her voice gone. Rachel gave her one last look, not cruel, not smug, just honest. Then she turned and walked out with the rest of the crew, leaving Paige behind, at the beginning of what she now knew would be the hardest conversation of her life. The last of the passengers filed out, their footsteps echoing down the jet bridge like a slow drumbeat of final judgment. Each one passed by Harold with a glance. Some respectful, some apologetic, others simply curious. But none of them forgot. You could see it in their eyes. What they had witnessed on that flight wouldn't disappear with landing. It had marked something in their memory, a moment of unfairness, a man's quiet power, and a storm that was just beginning. Celia, the older woman who had been seated across the aisle, stopped before stepping off. She looked at Harold and placed a hand gently on his arm. "I hope you make them feel what you felt," she said. Harold gave her a polite nod, his expression steady. "I won't need to raise my voice. They've already heard me." She gave a small, supportive smile, then disappeared into the terminal crowd. Now the cabin was nearly empty, just Harold in 1A, a few flight attendants finishing paperwork, and Paige standing near the galley, her back stiff, her fingers locked together so tightly her knuckles were white. The 2 suited men from the executive team returned to the front. One of them approached Harold again, this time with a softer tone. "We've arranged a private lounge space to speak, sir," he said. "We understand this incident has caused disruption, and we appreciate your patience." Harold stood slowly, collected his briefcase, and nodded. "Lead the way." As he stepped off the plane, Paige's eyes followed him. The sight of him walking calmly, without a word of anger, made her feel even smaller. She had hoped, in some strange way, that he would yell, that he would lash out, that he'd give her something to push back on. But he didn't. His silence was the worst kind of judgment, because it left no room for defense. Once Harold exited, the atmosphere shifted again. The security officer stepped forward holding a tablet. He tapped the screen and then looked at Paige. "Miss Carter, we'll need you to move to the forward galley. There's a formal process we're required to begin immediately." She followed him with slow, robotic steps, every inch of her body burning with shame. She sat in the jump seat at the front of the aircraft, her eyes cast down as the officer tapped through a checklist. One of the executives sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Let's be clear, Miss Carter," he said in a flat tone. This isn't a routine conversation. Mr. Green has submitted a formal incident report. The board has been notified. A full review of your conduct is underway." "I understand," Paige said, her voice barely audible. The officer looked up. "We'll need your personal account of what happened. Every word spoken, every decision made." She nodded again. "What made you question his seat assignment?" the executive asked. Paige hesitated. The answer burned behind her lips, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. "Because he didn't look like he belonged. Because I assumed." But the silence dragged on, and the pause said more than any confession. "I wasn't sure," she finally said. I thought it was a mistake." The executive leaned back slightly, unconvinced. "Did you think that because of his age? His appearance? His race?" Paige's breath caught. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away before they could fall. She didn't answer. "Protocol exists for a reason," he continued. "But what you followed wasn't protocol. It was instinct. And in this case, your instinct was discriminatory." She pressed her lips together, trying to hold herself steady. "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter," the executive said sharply. "Intent is irrelevant. Impact is what we answer to, and the impact of your decision could cost this airline far more than you realize." The officer continued logging her responses on the tablet. Every word was time-stamped, recorded, added to the report that would soon land on the desks of people who made decisions about careers, reputations, and liability. Meanwhile, Harold sat comfortably in a quiet lounge off the terminal. A fresh cup of hot coffee sat in front of him. He hadn't touched it yet. His briefcase remained at his feet, unopened. Across from him, one of the senior members of the board had just finished apologizing, for the second time. "We are deeply ashamed this happened, Mr. Green. We take full responsibility." Harold didn't speak for a long moment. Then he finally looked up. "I've spent decades trying to build something better," he said quietly. "Something fair. I didn't want power for myself. I wanted it so that people like me didn't have to keep proving they belong. And yet, here we are. Again." The board member bowed his head slightly. "We're taking steps. There will be accountability." Harold nodded slowly. "I'll believe it when I see it." Back on the aircraft, Paige sat alone after the questioning ended. The officer and the executive had stepped out, leaving her in silence. The jet bridge was empty now. The lights were dimmed. The plane that once felt like her territory now felt like a waiting room for judgment. She opened her crew tablet and checked her schedule. Her name had already been removed from upcoming flights. A single message appeared on the screen. "Pending review. All duties suspended. Further notice to follow." She closed her eyes. The cabin was cold now, or maybe it was just her. Her mistake, one moment, one decision, had unraveled everything. And somewhere down the corridor, Harold sat quietly in his chair, no anger on his face. Just a long memory, a deep sense of purpose, and the quiet understanding that sometimes silence is louder than anything else in the room. While the airline staff scrambled behind closed doors, the outside world had already begun asking questions. What happened on Flight 417 wasn't just staying in the air. It had started to echo across the ground, on phones, in inboxes, and on social media timelines. Videos taken by passengers showed clips of Harold standing calmly as he was asked to leave his seat. Another clip captured whispers in the first-class cabin, one voice clearly saying, "He showed her his ticket. Why is she still asking him to move?" By the time Harold's car arrived at his home that evening, several of those clips had already gone viral. Headlines began popping up one after another. "Elderly black man removed from first class. Turns out he owns the airline. Flight attendant suspended after throwing out VIP shareholder. Another lesson in how power looks different than we expect." Inside his home, Harold placed his briefcase on the hallway table, removed his coat, and sat quietly in his living room. The silence of home felt different than the silence on the plane. Here, it wasn't heavy. It was earned. His phone buzzed constantly, but he ignored most of it. Only one message caught his attention. It was from his attorney. Board meeting scheduled. CEO wants your feedback on internal reform proposal. Also, public apology in progress. Harold replied with just 2 words. Send draft. Across town, in a less well-lit apartment, Paige sat hunched over her kitchen table. Her hair was tied in a loose knot, her uniform jacket draped over the back of a chair. Her crew badge sat face down on the table. Her laptop was open, displaying the company's HR portal. The same message blinked at her for the 5th time. Status: suspension under review. A member of leadership will contact you within 48 hours. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. Every time her phone buzzed, she felt the same nervous pinch in her chest. She'd received messages from coworkers, some offering comfort, others staying neutral. But one message stood out. It was from Rachel. I hope you take this time to think, because this isn't just about Harold. It's about every quiet moment where bias wins, and how we either break it or become it. Paige stared at the screen for a long time before locking her phone. For once, she didn't try to defend herself. Her excuses had already crumbled in front of executives, her crew, and now the public. Elsewhere, inside the airline's corporate headquarters, executives met in a high-level conference room overlooking the city skyline. Screens around the room displayed the trending topics. Number accountability, in the air, number fly fair, number Harold Green. The CEO stood at the head of the table, flipping through printed reports. We're not just cleaning up a PR mess, he said. This is a reputation crisis. We let this happen on our watch. A senior advisor replied, It's not the first time this kind of complaint has come in, but it's the first time it reached someone powerful enough to force real change. Good, the CEO said sharply. Maybe that's what we needed. He turned to the head of HR. I want a full audit, every incident filed, every crew member flagged for discriminatory behavior, every complaint that was swept under the rug. Understood, she said, already typing. Then he turned to the group. And Harold Green, he's not just a shareholder. He's a founding name on our charter. We owe him more than a sorry. I want a full apology drafted tonight. Public, clear, no spin. We address the incident and announce the changes we're making. That night, a public statement was released across the airline's website and social media pages. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Harold Green and to all passengers who expect fairness, dignity, and respect in the skies. What occurred on Flight 417 was unacceptable. We take full responsibility. Effective immediately, we are launching a new training program on bias awareness, updating our flight protocols, and committing to a third-party audit of internal practices. Discrimination has no place in our company. It spread like wildfire. People across the country reposted it. Comment sections filled with mixed reactions, some supportive, some skeptical. But one thing was certain. The story had sparked a wider conversation. In Harold's home, he read the statement on his tablet. His lips didn't curve into a smile, but there was a softness in his expression, a quiet approval. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. He opened his laptop and began typing. Not a complaint, not a demand, but a list. A structured plan for reform. It included mandatory retraining, internal audits, passenger complaint hotlines, and performance reviews based on treatment of all passengers, not just those with status. He titled it simply, Accountability Proposal, Phase 1. And then he hit send. Harold wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't chasing headlines. What he wanted was more difficult, more lasting. He wanted change. And he knew that sometimes the loudest change starts quietly, with a calm voice, and a single call made by a man who refused to sit in the back when he had earned his place in the front. The next morning arrived with a different kind of pressure for everyone involved. News channels led with the story. Talk shows dissected it. Online forums buzzed with debates about race, class, respect, and appearances. One channel aired a short segment titled, A Seat He Paid For and Still Had to Prove He Belonged In. The video showed stills from the plane and an old photo of Harold Green from decades ago, standing beside a small group of airline founders, young and determined. In homes across the country, people watched with quiet anger and growing support. Some shared their own stories in the comments. Others tagged the airline, demanding they follow through on their apology. At the airline's headquarters, the board gathered for an emergency meeting. Around the long table, executives and advisors looked more tense than usual. The CEO walked in holding a stack of folders, each stamped with the words, Incident 417, Internal Review. Behind him, Harold stepped into the room, not as a guest, not as a victim, but as a shareholder, a voice the board could not ignore. He wore a charcoal suit, the same cane in his hand. His steps were steady, eyes sharp, demeanor calm. Everyone stood when he entered. "Good morning," Harold said evenly, taking his seat at the far end of the table. "Let's begin." The CEO nodded. "Mr. Green, first, allow me to say again, on behalf of the company, we deeply regret what happened. It was unacceptable. We failed, and we are ready to listen." "I'm not here to be pitied," Harold replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm here to make sure this company doesn't just say the right things, but does them." He opened the folder in front of him. Inside was the document he had titled the night before, Accountability Proposal Phase 1. He began to speak. "We're going to rebuild the way this company defines respect. That means retraining, not just for flight crews, but for supervisors, gate staff, and senior managers. That means real-time passenger reporting systems with follow-ups. That means measuring success not only by ticket sales, but by how people feel when they leave one of our planes." The room was still. The weight of his words landed hard. One executive finally spoke. "And what about the flight attendant involved in your case?" Harold paused. "She'll face the consequences, but I don't want her made into a scapegoat. The problem isn't just her. It's the culture that allowed her to act that way without question." He leaned forward slightly. "You want to protect this company's future? Then make this right, not just for me, but for every person who's ever been judged before they've even sat down." The CEO nodded, then turned to the board. "We move forward with the proposal. Full implementation. No delays." Harold sat back. He wasn't interested in applause or approval. He was interested in watching them do exactly what they'd just agreed to. Later that day, Paige sat alone in a corporate conference room with 2 members of Human Resources and a representative from the ethics office. Her suspension was still active. Her hands rested on her lap, clasped tightly, her voice quiet as she answered questions. "Do you now understand why your decision was seen as discriminatory?" one of them asked. Paige nodded. "Yes." "Was this your first such complaint?" Paige shook her head slowly. There were 2 others, small ones. "I didn't think—" "That's the issue," the ethics officer interrupted gently. "You didn't think. You acted based on a pattern. That pattern has now placed the company at legal and public risk." She didn't argue. She had no defense left. She had watched her career shrink down to this moment, and there was no script to fix it. "I want to apologize to Mr. Green directly," she said, "if he'll accept it." "That's not your decision to make," the HR manager said flatly. "Right now, your focus should be on whether you'll have the opportunity to return at all." They handed her a packet titled Corrective Action Review and instructed her to complete it within 72 hours. She took it with trembling fingers and left the room without another word. That night, Harold returned home to an inbox full of updates. The proposal had been approved. Phase 1 would begin within the week. A press conference was scheduled. Crew members across the country would begin mandatory training within 30 days. He scrolled through message after message. Support from fellow shareholders. Notes from employees he had never met. Stories from passengers who said, "Thank you for not staying quiet." But one message stood out. It was short, unpolished, honest. From Paige Carter. Subject, "I'm sorry, Mr. Green, I was wrong. I judged you. I acted out of bias whether I realized it or not. I can't undo the humiliation I caused you, but I will carry it. I will do the work. I am deeply sorry." Harold stared at the screen for a moment. Then he closed the message without replying. He didn't need her apology to move forward. What he needed, and what he had finally forced into motion, was much larger than words. Real change. And that was already happening. Days passed, but the echoes of what happened on Flight 417 continued to grow louder. Across airports, airline lounges, and employee break rooms, the story became more than a headline. It became a reference point. Crew members whispered about it during briefings. Passengers brought it up while boarding. New policies started appearing in inboxes, and a new kind of tension followed them. One that wasn't about turbulence in the sky, but pressure on the ground to finally do better. Harold, however, didn't bask in the attention. He kept to his routine. Mornings with the paper, phone calls with his legal team, and quiet evenings reviewing implementation plans sent by the board's compliance division. He wasn't doing interviews. He wasn't giving speeches. He was doing what he had always done best, making sure things changed, not in words, but in systems. Inside the airline's central training facility, a large screen lit up the new title: Bias Recognition and Passenger Respect, Phase 1, Mandatory Crew Training. A group of 30 crew members sat quietly as the instructor began. Each had a tablet in front of them. The very first video was a recorded message, and there, in sharp resolution, sat Harold. He wore the same gray suit. His tone was calm, direct. "I've flown with this airline for over 4 decades. I've sat in economy. I've sat in first. I've been treated well and I've been treated unfairly. What happened to me on Flight 417 was not about one mistake. It was about a moment that exposed a habit of deciding who belongs where based on appearance. That moment wasn't new. It was just caught by the right eyes at the right time. If you're watching this, you have the opportunity to do better. Not because of who I am, but because everyone deserves to sit in their seat without proving they belong." Silence filled the room when the screen faded to black. Some crew members looked down. Others stared straight ahead, uncomfortable but thinking. Meanwhile, Rachel stood at the back of that room, observing. She had requested to be part of the training oversight team, not for credit, but because she wanted to make sure this wasn't just a formality. Paige wasn't in that group. She had received a different assignment, an extended review program with in-person interviews, psychological evaluations, and a probation period. Her fate with the airline was still undecided. Her name wasn't on the upcoming rosters, but she had begun her corrective process, silently and without complaint. On her own time, she had started volunteering with a local community group that focused on anti-bias education. The first time she walked in, she didn't speak. She listened. She sat through every painful story told by people who had been judged, dismissed, or humiliated for nothing but how they looked or spoke. It was a room filled with strangers, but their experiences echoed back what she had once refused to see. She didn't wear her uniform anymore. She wore plain clothes. She introduced herself as just Paige. Back at Harold's home, a letter arrived. It was handwritten on plain stationery. "Mr. Green, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I've started to understand what I did. Not just to you, but to everyone like you who's been through it before. I'm not asking for a second chance. I'm asking for a harder path. The one where I learn, where I teach others, and where I stop pretending I didn't cause harm. Thank you for your silence. It said what I needed to hear." Paige Carter Harold read the letter once, then folded it gently and placed it inside a drawer, not as a keepsake but as a reminder. That same evening, the CEO sent him a message with a subject line that read simply, "Progress Update, Phase 2. It included data, training completion rates, compliance reports, new complaint handling procedures, and the beginning of a passenger dignity clause being added to the employee manual. Harold responded only once. "Continue. Watch the middle, not just the beginning." As the sun set, he sat in his study, watching the orange sky bleed into evening. He thought about how quiet his response had been. One call, one refusal to argue, one decision to remain seated, not in silence, but in strength. And now, across offices, training centers, and boardrooms, that silence had turned into action. Not because he demanded it, but because he made sure they couldn't ignore it anymore. A month later, Flight 417 was no longer just a number on a schedule. It was a symbol. Not because of the aircraft or its destination, but because of what it revealed and what followed. Airline after airline began updating their internal protocols, not from fear, but because the public had made it clear. Silence wasn't protection anymore. Passengers expected accountability. Employees demanded proper guidance, and industry leaders began asking the hard questions they had once ignored. Inside the training centers, crews were now required to complete real-world scenario reviews, many of them modeled after the Harold Green incident. His name appeared on internal materials, not in blame, but in recognition. Senior executives referenced the case as a turning point in corporate memos. Employees, especially newer recruits, were taught the difference between enforcement and judgment, between policy and prejudice. But for Harold himself, things had returned to a quiet rhythm. He didn't care for the spotlight. He had never chased headlines. He didn't even respond to the numerous interview requests from national news stations, documentaries, or university programs. What mattered to him wasn't the noise, it was the outcome. And slowly, that outcome was beginning to show in the smallest ways. On a cool morning, he received a phone call from the board secretary. "Mr. Green," the voice said respectfully, "I thought you'd want to know. Passenger satisfaction reports for the last 2 weeks show a significant drop in bias-related complaints, and Phase 2 is fully underway." Harold listened quietly. "Good," he said. "Keep measuring, not just announcing." That afternoon, for the first time since the incident, Harold booked a flight. Same airline, same class, same calm. When he arrived at the airport, the boarding staff greeted him by name. Not because of a warning, not because of a scandal, but because the new system automatically flagged passengers who had once experienced discrimination to ensure they were now treated with proper care. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply accepted his boarding pass, thanked the staff, and made his way to the gate with the same slow, steady walk, cane tapping lightly on the polished floors. On board, the flight attendant assigned to his section, an older gentleman named Joel, greeted him with a respectful nod. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Green," he said with calm sincerity. "Please let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight comfortable." Harold nodded once, his tone even. "Just let me sit in my seat." Joel smiled. "Of course." He sat in 1A, same as before. This time there was no pause, no stare, no question. Just silence, the right kind. Across the aisle, a young man recognized him. Not from fame, not from tabloids, but from the training video. His eyes widened for a second, then softened into a look of respect. "I just want to say," the man whispered, "what you did, it mattered." Harold gave a faint nod. "It always does, whether people notice or not." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Harold settled in, opened his book, and leaned back. No fanfare. No need for attention, just peace. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge, humiliation, or power. It was about dignity. About drawing a line where enough was finally enough. About knowing when to speak and when to say nothing, and let the world watch, listen, and change. And as the aircraft lifted gently into the sky, Harold stared out the window. Not at the clouds, but at the quiet proof that even a single call, made by one man in the face of quiet injustice, could reach places that shouted voices never could. He didn't just reclaim his seat, he shifted the ground beneath it, and that would outlast the flight. If this story made you feel something, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more powerful